Welcome to the Golden Age of Cinema podcast, a film review show where our panelists share their take on films from the Golden Age of Cinema, the 1990s.
Good evening and welcome to the latest episode of the Golden Age of Cinema, the podcast where three friends review entries into 90s film lore in the Golden Age of Cinema, so named after a drunken morning one day on a cricket tour in Barbados. As ever, I'm joined by my two fellow panellists, Seb James and Mikey Holmes. Evening, boys.
Hello, Matty.
Good evening.
This week we're covering 1992's Dracula, Bram Stokers Dracula, which was done by Francis Ford Coppola about 2 years after he did Godfather 3. This is the second, I guess you would call, thriller come horror film that we've done on the podcast after Cape Fear, itself another remake. Mikey, I believe this was your film, but before we hand over to you and the reasons why you chose the film, as usual, I'll hand over to Seb to give a bit of an overview of the film and the state of play. Seb, over to you.
Right, thanks very much, Matty. So Bram Stokers Dracula is the 1992 American Gothic horror film, which, as you say, Matty, was directed and produced by Francis Ford Coppola of Godfather fame. It's based on the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker, as it says in the title, and it stars Gary Oldman as the titular character, Winona Ryder, Anthony Hopkins, and Keanu Reeves.
Back for his second appearance on the Golden Age of Cinema.
Second Goak appearance. It released to a very good box office. It grossed 215 million against its production budget of 40 million. But of course, dear Keanu did receive a lot of criticism for his performance, and in particular his English accent, which I'm sure is something that we'll go into. The film was nominated for 4 Academy Awards and won 3 of them. It won for Best Costume Design, Best Sound Editing, and Best Makeup, so a lot of the technical Oscars. Although I think Gary Oldman was nominated for Best Actor, he didn't win it, but they won all the technical Oscars there. So look, it's a film by a very renowned director, starring some very renowned actors and Keanu Reeves, and was technically very well received by the Academy.
All of which had a bit of an off day in the 2-hour runtime. But we'll come on to that. Mikey, why did you pick it?
I think this film, Matty, has a lot to like for a 15-year-old boy, and that's the age I was when I first saw it. I saw it on video late 92, early 93, somewhere around that period. It had a very big marketing campaign, if I recall, which coincided with the cinema release. Due to the fact that it was very visually striking and had several very hot actors, certainly at the time, it took hold on pop culture. I do seem to recollect that casting Keanu as Harker raised some eyebrows, and unfortunately these weren't lowered upon receipt of the film. As you say, Matty, we'll come on to that. But I selected this film because, in my view, it's very much of the 90s, the early 90s. We're starting to see an increasing number of remakes. This was another example of an experienced director on the slide. Francis Ford Coppola coming off Godfather 3, a much maligned part of that franchise. The cast was very much the hottest actors of the day, as hard as that may be to believe now. They really were all on the up, pretty much all on the up. And I think it imprinted itself on popular culture, very much at the time. So you go back to some of the Simpsons parody, the Leslie Nielsen parody, I think Gary Oldman's performance, was iconic, not necessarily in a good way, but he was, he delivered very much a chameleon-like performance in this movie compared to his other work at the time. I think fundamentally, I recall that I enjoyed watching the movie. I do remember at the time thinking that the accents were bad, particularly Keanu, but he's not the only one. And I think that the style of narration, which we'll come on to in a little while, I'm sure. I found the style of narration, a little confusing. But I think overall, this film was very very visible in 1992. So it was very much of the time.
Seb, what about first impressions for you? What were your thoughts? I assume, was this the first time you'd watched it when you came to it for the podcast?
Yeah, this was the first time I'd watched it, but I had been, I would say, sort of exposed to this film since I think, during school, I think there was an English class that studied this film for their, for part of their sort of English course, and that kind of got me a little bit intrigued. But I never actually took the time to sit down and watch it, partly because I heard that it was a bit hit and miss, especially with the likes of Keanu Reeves' performance. But I'm very glad that it was on this list, and I'm very glad that I did watch it, because it's a very interesting film. I mean, instantly sort of the impressions that I had of it was like its first act was really pretty bizarre, and I was thinking, like, what on earth is going on here, and where on earth is it going? But as soon as you kind of get Gary Oldman or Dracula going to London, the plot really starts to heat up, and the movie kind of comes into its own. And obviously, when you add the firepower of someone like Anthony Hopkins coming in a very good supporting role, that's going to elevate the quality of what's going on screen. But my initial impressions of this film was that it's very ambitious in pretty much everything it does. This film is a real, Francis Ford Coppola swings, and he swings hard here. And I'm still struggling to think if he quite connects. I think there are some areas where he does kind of get it right, and I think there are some others where he falls flat on his face. But A plus for effort for me.
I think I was trying to remember when it was the first time I watched this, and it was a text exchange that I had with you earlier this afternoon, Mikey, which actually remembered it. So I studied the book at sixth form, so the original novel by Bram Stoker, and also in the same English literature class studied Frankenstein. So at the same time that I watched this film, and I think the Bela Lugosi one from 1958, I watched another Goak entry, which was Frankenstein in 1994, I think, which had Robert De Niro in there. So Robert De Niro was really getting in there with the remakes in the early parts of the 90s. But I remember the first time that I watched this, it wasn't the first Coppola film that I'd watched. I'd spent time with The Godfather and its sequels. I thought this was a real mishmash, and very strange. We'll come on to the next section when we speak about the acting, but really got the impression that it was a director who'd been completely let off the leash. I understand from doing a bit of background reading on this myself that it was much of a passion project for Coppola. It was one of his favourite books. It's something that him and Gary Oldman, they've been looking for ways to work with each other for a while. It's quite astounding, really, that they went to this. But I actually think Oldman's pretty good in it. But yeah, it's just really all over the show. The one thing that I really do like, which is not, I assume, have you two both read the book?
Yes, I have.
I haven't.
You haven't. One thing that I like that the film does is it gives a bit more of a backstory to the character of Dracula, so you can see a bit more of what he does and the reason why he becomes, whereas he comes in the novel and he's pretty much like a fully formed gothic entity, whereas here it's a lot more. There's a lot more background given. So yeah, the first time I watched it was for a sixth form class that I'd done on English literature. I thought it was a bit all over the show, probably much like my artistic credentials in judging films as a 17-year-old. So maybe I wasn't really in the best frame of mind to judge it then. But I quite enjoyed coming back to it now and looking at it again. And as I'm sure we're about to come on to, just how batshit crazy it is, pardon the pun, because it is just all over the shop. It really is in terms of acting, pacing, casting. It's a really, and that's not to say that I didn't enjoy it. I did actually quite enjoy it, revisiting it again, but it was a roller coaster ride, I think that's fair to say. But yeah, to come back to something that Mikey said, and probably one of the main discussion points that you've got to look at with this film is indeed the casting and who Coppola brought on board. So, Mikey, what do you think? What was going through the decisions to cast Keanu Reeves alongside Gary Oldman, and indeed Anthony Hopkins?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on in terms of the casting, Matty. I think, and I'm glad that you brought up the book, because, having read the book, which is an excellent read, by the way, I can see what Francis Ford Coppola was attempting, and I think the book partly explains the what I describe as the confused narrative structure of the film. If you've read the book, you'll understand that the narration does jump from character to character, as the film moves along. And I think he was trying to replicate that to a certain extent, but in my view, it really doesn't come off. I think the other thing is that Francis Ford Coppola hadn't had a hit, for a number of years. I think you've got to go back to the 80s for him having a solid success, and his film company Zoetrope, I think that had some financial difficulty when this was made. Coming off Godfather 3, I think he really did need a hit. At least financially, and fair enough, it did that. But I think part of what drove the casting of basically the hottest actors at the time, was that need for it to be financially successful. In my view, the main problem with the movie is the casting. I think, essentially the cast are the hot actors of 1992. You've got Keanu Reeves having done a number of works and being very hot in the early 90s. Winona Ryder was actually the hottest actor, female actor in Hollywood at the time.
Is that right? Because surely she was only about 20, 21.
Yes. I think movies like Edward Scissorhands, Reality Bites, very, very successful. And I think also this time she had something of a high-profile relationship with Johnny Depp. So, very prominent in pop culture. I think Anthony Hopkins is coming off Silence of the Lambs, so his stock was very high, and I think even some of the the sort of support cast like Kerry Ewells, I think that's how you say it. Kerry Ewells, he'd done some good stuff in the early 90s, so he was quite popular. But I think fundamentally there are some serious miscastings in this, and I don't just mean Keanu Reeves. I think Winona Ryder, Kerry Ewells, Sadie Frost, Tom Waits, I might argue even Anthony Hopkins are in my view, miscast in the roles that they're asked to play. I don't believe Sadie Frost as a member of the aristocracy.
Mrs. Jude Law.
Indeed, yes, indeed. I don't believe Winona Ryder is English. I don't necessarily believe Anthony Hopkins is Dutch. Tom Waits' performance is, he's quite a good actor, in the right role, I think, and the lead singer of a band, very, very distinctive gravelly voice. But in this, as Renfield, he's just constantly shouting, and it's just too much in my view. I think Gary Oldman gives a good performance. It's very chameleon-like. He morphs from the various entities that Dracula employs, I think, quite well. I think Richard E. Grant is good in this. I think I believe the Texan was the Texan, Billy Campbell, although incidentally he's from Virginia. So I think at the time I found the casting a little bit jarring. Watching the movie again a few days ago, I found this much more of a distraction. And along with the narration, I think the main thing preventing Francis Ford Coppola's, as Sebi rightly points out, very ambitious vision from coming to fruition.
I think just on that, I think that it's because it's such an ambitious film, and because it's as you say, Matt, you mentioned it's a roller coaster. It is. It's got so many different kind of parts to it. I mean, the first act and a bit is half of it's out of Pride and Prejudice, and then you kind of get into a slasher film, and then you get into like a bit of an action sci-fi fantasy film. So all of these actors that you're going to cast for these roles all have to have significant range. We know that Gary Oldman has range, and I don't think that there's anyone else who could have. There's any one actor who could execute as well as he did with what he had. I mean, this is a tough role. You've got to play a decrepit, creepy old man, a hounding wolf, a charming prince, and and like a upside down monstrous bat, all in the space of 2 hours. But I think Keanu Reeves and kind of Winona Ryder as potential Pride and Prejudice lovers in a period drama, that's just where it lost it for me.
Well, we've already spoke about Oldman. I think other people probably could have been other people within the movie. You could argue Anthony Hopkins could have done it, for example. But I think the only problem being is, and Mikey's already touched upon it, you're asking quite a lot of inexperienced pretty boy actors and actresses. So you're asking quite a lot of Keanu to carry the emotional weight and opening of the film. Winona Ryder, I don't think it's as bad as you guys are making out. I actually think she does quite good. And fair play to her. She's made to work for her money. I mean, pretty sure she kisses all the cast, which is, as I say, she's about 21. Anthony Hopkins must be pushing 60 odd. I mean, Coppola, come on. But
he's a bit creepy, isn't he, Coppola?
It is a bit. It's very creepy. But yeah, I think it's not been cast particularly well. Interesting. I've not really looked at it from your perspective, Mikey. That you probably felt that he needed to have a hit. I mean, commercially and critically, Godfather 3 is nowhere near as bad as people historically make out. I just had a quick look now while we were on while we've been speaking. That performed. So I don't know whether he still felt that he needed to do it, or that he needed a commercial success, but a bit muddled, and we all seem to be in agreement that it kind of lacks. I mean, the Renfield character, you're completely right, Mikey, is in the book, it's a really integral part, and it's just a guy shouting in a room periodically, and the insane asylum isn't really, which again is a really crucial element to the story, is not really covered. But
those are really good points, Matty. I think, as you say in the book, those are much more crucial, and really you can sort of see that probably they filmed more, but he cut it out. And just in terms of the financial aspects, I think Godfather 3, yes, it made a bit of money, but his film company Zoetrope was still in some financial difficulty, and it was the shot in the arm that it needed financially.
Just on the as someone who hasn't read the book, what sort of other integral part does the asylum play that was kind of cut out? Because I wouldn't know any different. I thought that the Renfield character was a bit crazy and it looked like something out of another film that we'll get onto, which was Batman and Robin. But it did. It cut like that whole bit of it. I was just thinking, this is very Batman and Robin. But what was the asylum story arc from the book?
Well, so it's a more focal point throughout the duration of the story, where you can see how more crazed Renfield gets. You got to remember, Keanu, Jonathan Harker was having to replace the Renfield character, and it shows how progressively more and more tormented Dracula and exposure to Dracula makes somebody, and that is kind of carried in the film with the women, Lucy and I forgot Winona. Yes, exactly, Mina. How they progressively become more and more obsessed and enveloped with Dracula. So it's not massively important, but it's quite a crucial element that is overlooked. But I think that's a really good point with which to jump off onto the next point of discussion, which is what we feel are the dominating themes. Now, I know each of you individually has got a bit of a few good areas that you want to touch upon. And Seb, I've got to start with you because I can't wait to hear about what you're going to say.
So look, I think just coming back from the book, and I think this is more a take on Dracula overall, but this film especially, it's an incredibly sexual film. I mean, pretty much every encounter that Dracula has with a member of the opposite sex is sexual and predatory for the most part. Especially with the Mina character and the Lucy character. And I think, and there was a point where when we're first introduced to Van Helsing, and he's just lecturing his students about syphilis and about how syphilis is spread in the blood and how it's grown with alongside civilization, how it's always been part of there and how it's transmitted in the blood again. And then someone comes and hands him a piece of paper and, basically, which is him getting summoned and off he goes. And then he's treating Lucy for this, the similar blood disease that she needs a blood transplant for, et cetera, and then it goes on as like, this she's going to be Nosferatu and stuff like that. So that instantly makes the connection of, right, this is basically, in my opinion, it's the cautionary tale about the dangers, the health dangers of sex. And specifically, I mean, if we look back at the source material written at the end of the 19th century, when there's there's no such contraception or sexual protection or anything like that, and these sexually transmitted diseases are a big and dangerous issue, and which is one of the reasons why sexual fidelity and no sex before marriage and things like that were valued principles at the time. Not just for religious reasons, but because they were practically healthier, because it limits your sexual partners and therefore limits the spread of these sexual diseases. And it's very much a cautionary tale of, look, the Sadie character is this more sexually promiscuous character, opposite Mina, who is, slightly more sexually guarded, but grows into her sexuality throughout the film in her encounters with Dracula.
Still loves reading a dirty mag, though.
Exactly, and that's the first time we get sort of introduced to sex, and certainly Mina's attitudes towards sex, and she's all innocent and stuff like that, whereas Sadie knows exactly what's going on. And then 3 new suitors come in, and Sadie's loving each one up one by one, being playing the field. And what's interesting is that when Dracula comes to London for the first time, he doesn't go straight for Mina. He goes for Lucy. And this is because Lucy is drawn out into, attracted to Dracula, for Dracula to take her. And he does. And that leads to her getting this illness and, that downfall. And it's interesting to think about the spread of the illness as well, because the spread of the illness comes from this very sexual encounter, the biting of someone's neck. It's a very, very sexual and intimate thing. And I think the whole thing is basically just like a big fat, cautionary tale.
Is it not just representative of the time in which the book was written, i.e. you repress women? At the Victorian era, women are there to be seen, not heard, and it's challenging that societal viewpoint with someone who, in Lucy, who has the capability of being able to chat to 3 women. The less said as well of just how much those 3 lads fawn over in that party, which is
that's very
hilarious
true.
Bit of overacting, especially from the American.
Yeah, that is quite bad. Very, very silly, but yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, without wanting to go into sort of, the historical oppression of women or anything like that, but, sexual freedom and the ability to be sexually free was, the wide use of contraception and of safe sex was a massive thing in propelling women's rights. So obviously before that, you have this period where, yes, women are repressed and, put in their place, certainly sexually, incredibly repressed sexually. And I think it is kind of like a caution of the times. But I just thought it was interesting, the parallels with that, and also the sort of cautionary tale of what happens to Sadie, the more promiscuous one, and what happens to Mina, the one who is very so nearly tempted and is in fact, has the encounter and essentially contracts the disease. But, she's really, really fighting hard, but he's so charming and he's so delightful that, the charms of a beautiful prince, doesn't matter if he, is rife with STD or not. You're still going to go for it, I suppose.
Interesting view. Mikey, what about you? You've got an interesting take on this, on what it means in good versus evil, I believe.
Yes, I think Sebi's theory is very interesting, and I certainly think it, to a large extent, it stacks up with what's in the movie and also the book. I sort of define things a bit more broadly. I see the main theme of Dracula, both the movie and the book, as being a story of good versus evil. I think Dracula, he is a parasite. He is evil incarnate, and I think that the 7 deadly sins are all represented, by him. If we think about wrath, he's very wrathful. He renounces the church and everything because his fiancée commits suicide. He feels betrayed and renounces God. I think envy. He envies Harker, his wife, his fiancée Mina. Lust. I agree with Sebi that this film is, and to a certain extent the book, is very sexual. There's lots of sexual connotations in it. Greed. I think he wants to expand his empire, wants to move to London, buy all the different properties, etc. Gluttony, this constant, feeding on blood and basically overeating, from a vampire's point of view. Pride, he's immensely proud. We see that when Harker makes the slightest sort of chuckle when he's giving his family history, and he pulls the sword out and explodes with anger. So I think I'm forgetting one.
Sloth.
Thank you. He's immensely slothful. He, most of the time he's in his boxes of earth, or he's been in his castle for hundreds of years, basically as a parasitic agent on the surrounding countryside. So I think that they're all represented there, and I think conversely, the movie shows what's required to defeat evil. So I think that the courage that the the band displays honesty. They have to be honest with themselves as to what they're up against, and they each accept that at varying points. Fortitude, solidarity, and ultimately sacrifice. All these things are required to overcome Dracula in this case.
And Winona Ryder in a tight corset.
Well, indeed. I don't think it would pass muster in actual Victorian times. But the last thing I'd say is, I think in the end, love and compassion come into it. Basically, Mina allows Dracula to be redeemed, and gives him release, at least in the film version. So for mine, it does come down to good and evil. I think I can paint it in those stark colours.
So, I'll challenge that if I could ever so slightly. In terms of like good and evil, yes, but I think the Dracula character is slightly more tragic and a bit more, human. Forgive me, because obviously he's not a human. But yeah, he's slightly more human, I think, and I think that this film, in terms of sort of its mission with the with the source material and with the vampire trope, was to sort of make vampires more complex and more interesting and more intellectually stimulating than they were previously seen, which is just basically like another monster. But I think that there are times when you sympathize with Dracula, where you are charmed by Dracula, and then obviously there are times where you are disgusted and fearful of Dracula. But it's I think he's a bit more tragic, and he's a bit more like a Greek myth than a sort of good and evil thing about him. I'd say.
I think what I'd say to that, Sebi, is ultimately he is cursed. He embraces evil, and the price of that is he is trapped in the form that he has to take. He's bound by certain rules. There's the as he fully converts Lucy to vampirism, he gives that little speech. I curse you to living death. Required to feed on the blood of the living, forever. So I think that there is the sort of the sense that he is captive to his choice, and ultimately he's enslaved by it.
I think an interesting take on that, and I'll weave it into my own views on some of the dominant themes that are in the film, is he is a little bit more nuanced. I think it is a little bit more nuanced than just strictly good versus evil. Let's not forget at the outset of the film, which isn't particularly, I'd say actually it's one of the good things that the film does in, as I mentioned earlier, adding some more background to the Dracula character. He has ended up the way he is because he feels he's been betrayed and let down by his faith.
Mm.
So right at the start, he's the one that's managed to conquer the Turks. He then is returning back to the castle, and his wife has been given false information and has killed herself, and that has completely made him lose his faith in what looks like Orthodox Christianity. And with that, I'd probably say that my take on it, when you were challenging me on my views on it earlier, were it's very representative and a really good snapshot of the end of Victorian Britain, and the reflections that I took away from it on what that meant and the synergy that it had with the Victorian Empire, how distrustful probably Bram Stoker and people of that era were of the foreign, definitely particularly of the East, so Turkey as an example, and how Middle England, or maybe not even Middle England, but Victorian England very much saw itself as above and beyond everywhere else, and they were very mistrustful of other nations. And also, as I mentioned earlier, just how the connotations of religion are, to me, show how society at the time was transitioning away from how domineering faith was, and how its impact was being lessened. Maybe that's something that Coppola was going for. I'm not so sure. It's definitely not reflected as much in the book. But I thought that was a really powerful sentiment for them to challenge and to use the vehicle of faith and Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, by a means with which Dracula transcends into a demon. I think that's quite a powerful thing to do.
Yes, and the use of Christianity and crucifixes, etc., to repel him and drive him back.
Yeah, and also there's several comments in. There's at one point when Jonathan Harker's shaving and Dracula sees the crucifix on his neck, and he says, "Don't put your faith in such trinkets," or I can't remember verbatim the exact word, but
trinkets of deceit.
Trinkets of deceit. Well, there you go. Yeah, I mean that's pretty out there, isn't it, for the time to be critical of Catholicism. So yeah, I think.
It's not being critical of Catholicism, because all of that is within the villain of the piece.
Yeah, of course.
So it's taking those sentiments of maybe again it's kind of saying, like, this is what happens when you lose your Christianity, or you lose your faith, or you lose touch with that side.
I think it's really interesting that we've each individually, and I don't think this has necessarily always been the case on the podcast, but we've each individually come from this from very different angles, and it's been quite interesting to see which themes we've pulled out. But as ever, as I do every week, I'm really intrigued about what people's favourite scenes are. Seb, we'll start with you. I think we'll leave Mikey till last for a change, just given that it was his film. But what about you, Seb? What was your favourite scene?
It's a pretty difficult question to answer, actually. But I think, look, there's a lot that I kind of like about this film, and I like that it's very ambitious, and I think that it does quite a lot to encapsulate the gothic nature of the story. And I think I really noticed that when Keanu Reeves arrives in Transylvania and is brought to the castle in sort of carriage. I was just really like the ambience of the set and the coach and the kind of demonic atmosphere. I thought, okay, well, this is quite an interesting kind of draw into the film, which I think was done quite well, but obviously, is let down kind of either side of it with having to focus on Keanu and his performance, unfortunately. But I would say that I was very much impressed with the kind of set and the ambiance that was created during that scene. So I think I'm gonna go with that one.
Interesting. For me, and it's not particularly an adventurous pick, or I was looking out there for something particularly out there or adventurous. I really liked the time when you're initially introduced to Dracula.
Really?
Yeah, because at the time that I remember watching this, so the Bela Lugosi film, it's very minimal on audio. The introduction to Castle Dracula is the film was first made. The first time this was adapted for film was 1931, I think. The Bela Lugosi film's in 1958. Minimal audio, and I think that a lot had been done and a lot of effort had been made. And I did mention about this earlier in the week, that there's a lot of things similar, particularly visually, that this film does that Cape Fear did, for example. So quite crass and bargain basement special effects, like drawing colours over the sky, which Cape Fear did, so different colours over the sky, and the eyes, how there's two scenes overlapping over one. And I actually think it's one of the bits that the film really does well, is it speeds far too quickly from setting the scene as to why Harker is going to Transylvania. There's that really hokey scene where Harker's talking to his boss and just goes, "Well, you've got to go." But when you actually see when Harker arrives at Castle Dracula and he goes into the room and you first see Gary Oldman as the Count, and then they're sitting down for dinner, and something that you just touched upon, it's quite a nice little introduction, and it is actually really scary. Whereas I think it reminded me when I watched it again today, when I remember reading the book, and you're really on tenterhooks as to this. You've read all these, some of Harker's voice notes, I think they are in the book. Well, not voice notes. I can't remember what the name of it is, but you've got in your mind this terrifying character. And actually, when you first introduced to him, yeah, he looks a bit peculiar, but there's something not quite right. But he's playing the very hospitable host. And whereas I don't think the film does decent effort with a lot of different elements of the book, this bit I thought it really nailed, and I thought it was a really good introduction to the character of Count Dracula.
On that, I didn't like that scene because I just thought it made such a mismatch of like Oldman versus Reeves, and that kind of ruined it for me.
Yeah, I mean, I can potentially see that, but I'm not looking at it focusing on Keanu. I'm looking at it actually from the performance of, and probably unintentionally, I think maybe his wooden delivery and helps exacerbate the awkwardness of his introduction to it. No doubt that wasn't the intended means as to why he couldn't deliver audio in anything more than a monotone delivery. But yeah, I thought it was good. But yeah, Mikey, your film, favourite scene, what was it?
I think, like Sebi, I struggled a little bit to come up with a favourite scene. As I have actually to come up with an overall rating for it. I think in totality, overall, it has some pleasing aspects to it. I think it's very visually impressive and certainly very, very ambitious, and fundamentally, I think it is entertaining. And really, when I was looking for a favourite scene, as I started to sort of drill down on each individual, component, I did sort of look and I thought, well, actually, that's not so good. That's not so good. I think what I come up with in terms of a favourite scene is when Lucy is confronted in the crypt. When she's become a vampire and she's stolen a child, which incidentally in the book is much more developed. She's ravaging Hampstead Heath, incidentally, and that has a lot more detail in the book. But I think in terms of the movie, it's the part where all the Arthur and Quincy and Dr. Seward, they're all forced to confront the truth, as ugly as it is, and I think it's a very scary scene. I think rumor has it that the child actress in that was actually terrified by Sadie Frost's makeup. And I think it's it's done very well. So overall, that would be my favourite scene.
Interesting. Well, I'm intrigued now, given that you've both expressed confusion as to how you might mark this. But yeah, no, I think again 3 very diverse picks from what we've taken away and what we've picked as our favourite scenes there. So we'll move on to do as we do every week and give a rating for this film, whereby we judge it of the barometer of the liar metric. For those of you who don't know, and I'm sure there's not many of you know, we judge every film on the Golden Age of Cinema podcast against the Titanic representative of the age performance delivered by Jim Carrey in 1997's all-time classic, not just of the 1990s, but of all cinema, Liar Liar, whereby cinema executives realised they could do no better, tore up the rule book and started with 1998's Batman and Robin. That's probably not even correct. But Seb, I'll go with you first because we should give Mikey the last word, given it was his choice. What are you giving this Liar Liars out of 10?
Yeah, look, as I say, you could really give this a big range. It's a really, really ambitious film, and Ford Coppola has tried so hard, and I think that, you know, if I'm going to go plus points, I'm going to say the overall ambiance of the film, the performances of Oldman, and in my opinion Hopkins. I actually quite liked Anthony Hopkins' performance in it. I know we haven't really talked about it that much, but I think it's actually quite a good turn. Obviously, you know, I think the story is a good story. It's a gripping story. But I think, you know, there are some negative points in terms of the pacing of the film. I think it's very two-paced. You know, it's very slow for the first bit, and then it ramps up really, really quickly, almost too quickly, and they're quite disconnected. And obviously, you know, the performances of some of the less experienced members of the cast kind of show. I think when you leap for greatness, as sort of, you know, to use another Goak example here, when Neo leaps, or rather Mr. Anderson leaps from that one building to try and get to the other, he gets very, very close, but he still doesn't make it, and he still falls all the way down. So I think I'm going to have to give this one a 5. I'm going to give it 5 Liar Liars out of 10.
Wow. I think, is that the lowest you've given something?
No, I gave 4 Rooms 4.
Oh, did you? I mean, that's far too... never mind. Do you know, I think this might be the first time then that I'm going to give a film a higher rating than yourself. I struggled watching it. I will admit, when I came back to it yesterday, it does take quite a bit of mental dexterity and effort to get through it. But at the same time, it's a piece of work, or based on a novel that I've got a lot of time for. I've got a lot of fond memories of reading it. Less said, the better about the fact that there's 0 trips to Whitby. Shout out to Whitby with North Yorkshire's best fish and chips, arguably the country's best fish and chips. But it was really good film in parts, but the bad parts of it, the casting, some of the mismanagement of how it's paced, do let it down. But I did enjoy it, and I think Coppola not really done that much. I don't think he's done anything, probably the best part of a decade. Still like the smatterings of magic there, and Gary Oldman, given this is nearly 30 years ago, this film, he's already there, right? As said, touched upon right at the outset of the podcast, already given an indication of the range that he's capable of, and a character which up until that point had been very hammy. That's obviously a take on the Hammer horror when it was done before, so always done a little bit tongue-in-cheek, not particularly scary. I genuinely thought that at some points he can be quite terrifying in the role, and he transversed it from being the Lothario to the Count, etc. very well. So I'm going to give it a 6, despite its flaws. Mikey, over to you. I understand that, as you said earlier, you found this quite difficult. One final bit, would you regret choosing it to review? If you could let us know that in your answer.
Interesting question, mate. Thank you. Overall, I did struggle with rating this film. I could sort of, I think given it anything from 4 to 8. I think it is entertaining. I enjoyed watching it at the time, and to a certain extent, I enjoyed watching it a few days ago. I think it is visually striking. The camera work is quite good. I think the set design, the costume design, especially given I believe the vast majority of it was filmed in the studio, it was not filmed on location. And overall, I admire Francis Ford Coppola for his ambitious vision. I think he has tried to stay true to the source material. However, I think the execution does leave something to be desired. The book is well worth a read. The first time I read it, I couldn't put it down. So I think the source material really is excellent. I'm actually going to give this 6 minus 1 liar liars. I think fundamentally it's an entertaining film, but I take the point away because the quality of the source material is such. It's a proven book. It's been done well as movies in the past, and I think fundamentally the director butchers the source material.
Oh.
So I think it's still an entertaining movie, but it's 6 minus 1, so 5 liar liars for me. And in terms of do I regret selecting this film? I don't. I think when it first came out, it imprinted itself on popular culture straight away. I think Gary Oldman's performance, very fine actor, immense range. If you think of all the work that he did within a sort of the 5-year period, I mean, he is a great actor. The ultimate chameleon. Really, I struggle to think of somebody who's got more versatility. So fundamentally, I don't regret choosing it. I think it's produced some interesting talking points. The source material, as I say, is excellent. The book is excellent. You should give it a read. But I don't. I'm not sort of going away thinking this is a really great film, and I do have an impression of what it might have been with the right cast, the right narration, the right pace, combined with the visually striking nature of the movie, and it's very very stylized, very sexy, etc. So I see what it could have been. But unfortunately, like as Sebi rightly pointed out, it does fall short. So it's an interesting one to discuss. Put it that way.
Very interesting.
Yeah, no, for sure. And as I say,
I for one don't regret you picking it because I really did enjoy. I enjoyed watching it and analysing it from that point of view, whilst recognising that, as we mentioned, it did fall short in terms of its quality.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it. And to me, it's quite fascinating that it's the first film that I've reviewed higher than either of you. So enjoyable nonetheless. Well, if we look forward, so Dracula's in the can, or in the coffin. Sorry. Can we move on to next week? Seb?
Well, it's a good thing that you're starting the comedy off early here, because next week we've got a comedy classic. We've got 1993's Groundhog Day, directed by Harold Ramis and written by Danny Newman, starring the great Bill Murray, a true Goak actor, a true Goak great. I can't wait to review this film. It was my pick. It's one of my favorite films of all time. I don't think there are many other comedies that get it spot on quite like this one.
And Andy McDowell, an enigma of 90s casting.
Andy McDowell, yes. I mean, really, it's difficult for me to look past Bill Murray because this is the Bill Murray show.
Yeah, no, and I've actually only ever watched it once, which was...
The whole point is that you have to watch it over and over and over again.
Well, yes, quite. So I'm looking forward to revisiting it. And isn't it the film as well where Bill Murray and... Remind me of the director?
Harold Ramis.
Yeah, where they fall out.
Yeah, because they did Ghostbusters before this.
Yeah. But I think this is the film that broke their relationship. But yeah, no, really looking
Well
forward
worth
to
it.
And yeah, be interesting. Well, thanks again for that, gents. Look forward to catching up next time, and look forward to Groundhog Day.
Thanks, Matty. Look forward to it.